I'm using Zoom.
Well, usually we're on WebEx, but we wanted to be fancy this time.
Nice.
We're
Zoom fans.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay, well, let's get started. Thank you all for joining. My name is Nicholas Slayton. I'm a second-year medical student here at GW. I'm the president of the AMA here at GW, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Mike Ibarra. Mike is a ER physician and also the VP of Medical Affairs and Advocacy and Strategic Alliances at PhRMA, which for those of you who don't know, PhRMA is the trade association that has member organizations of all the pharmaceutical companies that you've heard of, including Pfizer, and we will be talking about that for full disclosure. Additionally, full disclosure, Mike used to be actually my boss. So this was actually a conversation that I wanted to just track him down to have, just to talk about the COVID vaccine, the updates, the innovation that we've seen, and especially over the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of important news that's been coming out. And right before we get into this phase of vaccine distribution, I thought it would be great for us to just all convene and talk about, what the pharmaceutical industry has done over this year, and what they plan on doing for this next phase of vaccine distribution. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Ibarra for joining us.
Oh, can you hear me?
There you are.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Nick. Really appreciate the invite. It's good to see you virtually. Sorry we can't do this in person. Folks may recognize me. I don't know, in terms of years that folks are, I tend to do a lecture for, I believe, the third-year students on conflicts of interest. Did it virtually this year, although it felt really different to talk about conflicts of interest because personally, I feel like right now we have one enemy, and that's COVID-19. It's not about lunches and pens. I really think it's all hands on deck to try and get us out of the pandemic mess that we're in. And industry has a really unique, unparalleled role to play. And hopefully over the next few minutes, we can kind of share that. All of our lives have been upended. I know it's been very hard for you all doing school virtually. Clearly for me, working clinically, getting to well, I guess going back to med school to become a COVID expert, it's a disease I didn't learn about in med school. And all of a sudden it's all I'm caring for the first couple months of the pandemic. And now thinking about it every day, every waking moment of every day from a clinical standpoint, and then from a non-clinical standpoint as well. So COVID is all consuming for all of us. I do feel like there's starting to be a light at the end of the tunnel. I think we're at the beginning of the end. I don't think we're at the end of the beginning. I really do think we're at the beginning of the end. It's been a really long, dark time up to this point, and it's going to be a hard couple of months. But I think hopefully by the end of the briefing, we'll kind of feel more positive that we're really starting to get there. So if you want to go to the next slide, Nick has been, Nick did work for us at PhRMA for some time. Don't hold that against him. It's a really great organization. We were really lucky to have him, and he helped me quite tremendously. And we can talk about career, how you get to where you are in your career. At some point in this talk, it's what I focus on for the GW conflicts of interest presentation. But it's been I've been at PhRMA for 6 years, and it's been a real amazing experience, and particularly now. It's an amazing, really dynamic industry. It's been all hands on deck as it pertains to COVID. The industry's really come together. Competitors that used to compete against one another, they're still competing, but the real kind of thing that they're trying to beat is the virus. It's not a race against each other. It's a race to try and end the pandemic. Vaccine development in particular is a really complicated process. It usually takes many, many years to develop, test, and manufacture one. And the world, the US and the world needs not one vaccine, they need many vaccines, and vaccines that use multiple approaches, multiple scientific modalities, so that we have a safe and effective vaccine for every billion, multiple billion people in the world, for different countries that have different healthcare infrastructure, different parts of this country that have different healthcare infrastructure. So we talk about needing multiple shots on goal for two reasons. The first is that it's very complicated and some of these vaccines are going to fail in clinical trials. And then also second, because it's a very big, it's a big planet we live on, and there are different needs for different parts of the planet. So we need to have different approaches studied. All of this is happening very, very quickly. And it's not because steps are being skipped. It's because of a couple of factors. Number one, we know a lot more today than we did 10 years ago about coronaviruses themselves. This is not the first coronavirus. There are 5 others or 6 others that cause disease in humans. So this is not it's a novel coronavirus, but it's not the first coronavirus. So we know about this coronavirus. You probably have learned about it before. It's called corona because corona is Spanish for crown or Latin for crown. And it, indicates that kind of outer package that the virus is wrapped in, which is the spike proteins that make it look like a crown when you look at under microscopy. So we knew a little bit about coronaviruses and we know a lot about vaccine development. And so we were able to take that knowledge and apply it really, really quickly. And pharma companies, member companies and non-member companies invested in technologies because they have capital. They have capital that allowed them to invest in technologies that allowed them to quickly develop vaccines. So I saw a great timeline even just this morning on Twitter. It only took 2 days to make the mRNA vaccine that is in the Moderna trial. The genetic code was posted by a Chinese scientist on January 11th. And by the 13th, they had made the vaccine candidate. But it took years to develop the mRNA platform that allowed them to quickly sequence it. It's like saying, I made a copy and it took me, 2 seconds. Well, you couldn't have made that copy without the copy machine, right? You need to have the investment in the copy machine. So companies needed to develop this mRNA platform. And it was kind of ready for this unique point in time. And to that extent, not to say that we're lucky at any point in this pandemic, but it's been a really important thing that we are glad that we had, particularly since the first 2 vaccine candidates are mRNA. So I mentioned a lot is happening in parallel instead of in series, meaning we're doing things kind of, somewhat out of order. For example, companies are already manufacturing vaccines, even though they don't know if they're approved or authorized yet. So we're making them now with the idea that once they're approved, you need to ship them that day or the next day. We've seen this happen with antibodies, with Gilead's remdesivir. Talk about that a little more in a second. Also being able to use kind of digital clinical trials, adaptive clinical trials. I'm actually in one of the vaccine clinical trials. I signed up online and was recruited or was accepted into the Moderna clinical trial. And, instead of driving to University of Maryland, thank goodness, because driving to Baltimore every day would have been painful. I was able to just download an app and enter in my vital signs that I took at home. I was able to, do calls instead of, in-person visits, virtual visits. I did have to go up there to get the shot. You can't give the shot virtually, but I went up there twice to get the shot, did a physical exam, a month after the second shot. So it's been great to be able to do a lot of this virtually. And that's, a relatively new prospect as well. I think you can go to the next slide at this point. So I'm an emergency physician by training. I moved to DC in 2004 after I went to college. I went to med school at Georgetown. I went to residency at Georgetown. I worked at Georgetown. I know that there's an invisible wall between GWU and Georgetown on M Street where nobody crosses over. And, I haven't crossed over to GW, but I do appreciate the invite and the collaboration in this webinar and having a Georgetown physician. But I'm also VP of Medical Affairs at PhRMA. And in that role, kind of get to talk about the medical aspects to the medical community. So I met Nick at the AMA meeting in 2018, maybe, or 17, maybe 19. I don't remember, sorry. So I get to go to those meetings and I get to provide industry perspective. It's a really cool experience. Not everybody loves pharma at those meetings, but it's been great to meet people and provide the perspective. There are other folks that attend the meetings as well, like specialty society members, members of the FDA go to the meetings, the NIH. So it's a really interesting experience. Our member companies are looking at vaccines, but they're also looking at therapeutics, a range of investigational therapies. The member companies that you probably recognize are Pfizer, because they're in the news pretty much every day right now. But there are a number of member companies of ours that are in both the vaccine and the non-vaccine space, and even member companies that aren't particularly specifically investigating therapies. They might actually be lending manufacturing capacity. So we've seen partnerships where a company has the ability to make monoclonal antibodies and they're partnering with a different member company to say, I'll make your antibody on my platform. We can share space, for lack of a better term. You can share our capacity, which is really, really important because some of these therapies take months to make. Remdesivir, which is the first antiviral, the first FDA approved treatment for coronavirus. That medicine initially took, I believe, like 9 months to manufacture. And so they had to figure out a way to make it in a much shorter time frame. They had to find a way to source the raw materials and manufacture it quickly. Antibodies are very similar. It's not just a chemical experiment. These are biologics that take a long time to make. So this collaboration has been really, really important. If you go to the next slide. So this is my kind of way of breaking up COVID therapeutics and vaccines. I think of everything, like a good ER doc in really simple terms. Not a neurosurgeon. I talk about it and think about it in terms of the big buckets of how we would approach a patient that has this. And when I first started seeing COVID patients in April, we had nothing. We had absolutely nothing. You would come to the ER with COVID symptoms. We would test. It would take weeks for the test to come back. We'd tell you to isolate. We'd admit or discharge people. Not that it made a huge difference because we didn't have anything to offer admitted patients, but aside from oxygen, of course, and in the worst case scenarios, intubation. But things are getting better from a treatment standpoint. Obviously, we wanted it to be over, so we need the pandemic to be over, but it is good to have more tools in our toolbox. We have antivirals, we have antibodies, we have anti-inflammatories, we have anticoagulants, antibiotics, and then soon we'll have vaccines. So antivirals, if you actually, I think you can just hold on the last one for a second. I'll just double click verbally, but not physically, sorry. Antivirals are medicines, of course, that directly target the virus itself. The idea with COVID is that COVID kind of has two phases, right? You've got the first phase where the virus itself is rearing its kind of ugly head, causing you to feel sick with all the symptoms. And then you have the second phase where it's actually the virus is probably largely gone or not really causing most of the damage. The damage to your body is actually from the immune system being overactivated, and it's kind of creating collateral damage on the organs because of that overactivation of the immune system. So we kind of think about treatment in like two waves. You've got the initial wave, and then you've got the second wave. And so antivirals are very important for that first wave. And Gilead's remdesivir is a medicine that's an infused medicine. It was studied in hospitalized patients with COVID-19, and it was found to shorten the duration of time that patients spent in the hospital. That's something really, really important because hospital capacity is probably the thing that we're most worried about, number of beds in the hospital. So if you have a medicine that can lower the number of days in the hospital, that's a really, really good thing. It hasn't been shown to decrease mortality, so a lot on med Twitter kind of criticize it for that. But as I've kind of pointed out, days in hospital is a really important kind of patient-centered outcome, and it's something that will help us from health system standpoint. And I think in part, this is my own kind of theory, just knowing a little bit about the pathophys. If you go to antibodies, antibodies, these are these new therapies. They're basically immune systems in a bottle. And there are a few approved therapies now. Eli Lilly has a COVID-19 antibody called bamlanivimab, which is really fun to say, bamlanivimab. There are a couple of other companies in this space. Regeneron has a I guess a polyclonal antibody. It's a combination of antibodies, two antibodies that work together. And again, you give this to people early in the disease, and the idea is that it can basically be an immune system in the bottle and try and eradicate the virus before your immune system kind of overreacts to it, as it is doing in some cases. We have supply in DC. The government bought all of the antibody that has been made so far, and they're allocating it to states based on their size. Georgetown has a supply, so we have a criteria that we use when we see a patient to decide if they might be a recipient for the antibody. I haven't yet prescribed it. It's only been out for about 2 weeks, but I am kind of interested in looking for patients that might fit the right criteria. As supply becomes more available, I think more people end up being offered the antibody, but right now we kind of have stringent criteria for who might get it. And you can probably imagine who that is. It's probably like a 65-year-old or like an 85-year-old nursing home resident that gets tested and turns out positive, but they don't yet have any symptoms. That'd be like the perfect person for it because they're likely to have a bad outcome. They're in a high risk setting. So anyway, we're thinking about it that way, but the more it becomes available, I think the wider indication for using that. The third bucket you can see in yellow is anti-inflammatories, and these are really important in the second phase of COVID, that kind of hyperimmune phase of the illness. And the medicines that we have in this bucket are one that you probably know. It's called dexamethasone. It's a steroid that's been around for about 50 years. And it was actually found to reduce mortality in hospitalized patients on oxygen. So it's one of the most important treatments that we have. There are other anti-inflammatories that are being studied or actually have authorization for treatment in COVID that are actually like rheumatoid arthritis treatments, because those are also anti-inflammatory or somewhat immune suppressing medicines. So that's the anti-inflammatory bucket. And then, as you probably know, you've read, in People magazine or in medical journals or both about the weird effects that people have with COVID. People present with blood clots or strokes. And for whatever reason, this disease has, impacted celebrities. I think that was one of the scary early stories we read about some of those celebrities. The Broadway actor that had blood clots ended up dying from COVID. So for whatever reason, this virus has a kind of procoagulant effect. So obviously anticoagulants play a role in the treatment for some patients. And then finally, antimicrobials or antibiotics. People get admitted to the hospital, they get bacterial superinfection, so antibiotics play a role. I know the reason that you wanted me here, though, is to talk about the vaccine. So the last bucket's a vaccine. If you go to the next slide now, there are hundreds of clinical trials underway to look at investigational therapies and vaccines. We talked about remdesivir being the first FDA-approved treatment. We talked about bamlanivimab, which is a monoclonal antibody. Those are both totally de novo new therapies that didn't exist before COVID. There's, of course, the medicines that were already on the market that are being looked at. But the real news is the development of vaccines in a really remarkable time frame. You know about Pfizer, Moderna, probably because they're talked about every day in the news, but there are hundreds of other trials going on for other vaccines and other vaccine candidates. If you go to the next slide, I showed this picture of the virus because I think it's helpful for me, again, simple brain, to think about looking at the virus and trying to understand how we're targeting the vaccines. Because of the spike protein that sits on the outside, one of the early theories in the kind of super smart vaccine world, that Dr. Fauci's of medicine, decided that the target for the vaccine should be this spike protein. And, it seems, would trust almost anything that Dr. Fauci says. But the amazing thing about science is we didn't know that was going to actually work until we did clinical trials to find out. You can study it in blood. You can see if the antibodies, develop, if you develop antibodies to vaccines against these spike proteins. But you don't know if it's actually going to prevent disease until you do the large scale clinical trial. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the important thing to know about the vaccine, the vaccine targets, are that really most of them are going after the spike protein, which sits on the outside of the virus. So if you go to the next slide. When people hear vaccine, and I'm just going to say this because you never know, I think most people on this call don't, but you never want to assume. And I know there's a lot of vaccine kind of confidence issues right now, but I think a lot of people hear vaccine and they immediately think, oh, I'm getting like a deactivated form of COVID. And what if I get sick from it? What if I actually get COVID from the vaccine? And that's really not, that's like classic vaccine technology from years ago. And while it's possible that some form of that may be investigated, that's not really how the leading vaccine candidates at this point are working, and generally not how kind of new vaccines are really developed. There's a variety of approaches that are being looked at. You can see them all kind of here. The idea of the leading vaccine candidates, meaning the ones that are furthest along right now, is this mRNA technology, which is super cool, not yet been deployed, but makes a whole lot of sense, and it clearly is extremely effective. The mRNA approach is being looked at by Pfizer and Moderna. The other kind of leading candidates, meaning furthest along, are the vaccine adenovirus vector approach that J&J and AstraZeneca with Oxford have partnered to develop. And then some of our other companies are looking at the non-replicating viral vector or the protein subunit approach as well. And again, like all of these approaches have different characteristics. The vaccines need to be stored at different temperatures. So it's good to have a lot of different approaches. And while I think ideally every vaccine would be approved in every population, I don't think that, there might be certain populations that respond better to different vaccines. So having a lot of data and a lot of vaccines out there is generally a good thing. The mRNA approach, the best analogy I heard about this, I read it in an NPR article, is to think of the mRNA vaccines like a M&M, where the chocolate is the mRNA and then the outer shell is the kind of fat coating that it's encased within. M&Ms, if you didn't encase them in that kind of outer shell, the chocolate would melt. mRNA similarly very quickly degraded. It's transient. It's not going to live in your body forever. It's just a little shard of mRNA that you get in an injection. Your body takes it up. Your ribosomes make whatever it codes for. The mRNA is gone in a couple of days. And the hope is that whatever it made, in this case, the little spike proteins, your body recognizes those as foreign and then develops antibodies against them. And then those antibodies protect you against COVID down the road if you ever get exposed. So in theory, this sounds really easy, like, oh, let's vaccinate against the spike protein, but there's so many ways that it could go wrong. It could not work. You could develop antibodies and those antibodies aren't enough to prevent COVID. And what we found in the early clinical trial data and why so many folks are really excited, myself included, is that these vaccines not only give you antibodies against the spike protein, but those antibodies are highly protective against COVID-19 infection, or highly efficacious against COVID-19 infection. So the efficacy rates are upwards of 95%, which puts it on par with some of the most effective vaccines ever invented. You think about the flu shot, which is like 40 to 60% effective. I think measles is 98. These being 95 are really, really up there. These are like the best childhood vaccines that we have. So it's really exciting stuff. I think you can go to the next slide now. So we've had a ton of really good news. AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are both still in phase 3 clinical trials with adenovirus vector vaccines. And then Moderna and Pfizer both studying mRNA vaccines. They are seeking FDA authorization. And the AD committee, the advisory committee, is meeting for Pfizer next Thursday, December 10th, and then Moderna's on December 17th. So the efficacy data is really good. I'm going to mess the numbers up slightly, but one is like 95, one's 94 point something. And what that means is they injected, thousands of people, in a 1-to-1 ratio, some of them getting vaccine, some of them getting placebo. I'll take the Moderna trial since that's the one that I'm in. Moderna did enroll 30,000 people. I went in August and got my first shot. I went in September and I got my second shot. And then I was told to just live my life. And they checked in with me every day. I didn't get COVID, but 196 people in the trial did. Of the 196 people in the trial that got COVID, 186 of them, or 184, something like that, sorry, were in the control group, the placebo group. So those people just got saline in their arm. And then a small number of them, like 10, I believe, had gotten the vaccine. Of those infections of COVID, 30 of them got severe COVID, meaning like they needed to be hospitalized or they needed to be intubated. One of them actually died in the trial. And all of those people, all 30 of them and the one person that died, all got placebo. So the COVID infections clearly were less severe and nobody died in the vaccine group. So that's where they come up with that 95% efficacy number. And then it's also just good to know that it prevents, of the people that got COVID, I haven't seen the data, so I don't know what their clinical scenario was, but I'm hopeful. And it seems like they may have had like a really mild case of it, hopefully. And the Pfizer numbers are very similar to that. So it's really, really exciting, and I think what you hear folks like Lena Wen and other like super smart public health folks that are on TV all the time talk about is, seeing this light at the end of the tunnel and having a highly efficacious vaccine on the horizon means that everything that we're doing now, social distancing, mask wearing, hand sanitizing, making hard choices about life and doing inconvenient things is that much more valuable because we're really on the cusp of having something that can kind of put an end to the pandemic. And as Nick knows, I always try to think of analogies to explain things to folks. And what I've been trying to tell my family is like, this is kind of like going skydiving, the month before, the parachute is invented, you know that the parachute's coming out and you really want to skydive, but you're not willing to wait for it. So you jump out of a plane without it thinking, oh, it'll be around in a month. Like that just doesn't work. So this vaccine can be thought of in similar ways. It's going to provide a tremendous amount of protection to make it safe to do the things that we want to do. And it'll be out soon. So I think with that, that's kind of, my spiel on COVID vaccines. I'm obviously super excited. I was excited enough to participate in the trial. I don't know if I got vaccine or placebo, but Moderna sent a letter kind of saying if they get an authorization then they'll contact the people that got placebo and find a way to cross them over, because it is somewhat, kind of unethical to hold people in that control group if you have such an effective vaccine. So personally, that's kind of my story, and we'll find out in the coming weeks what I got and if I need to get an additional shot. So anyway, thank you, Nick, for inviting me. Thanks to everyone for joining and listening to the spiel. And I think you had some questions that I'm happy to take.
Yeah, so I hope, I think, as clearly Mike has demonstrated, he is one of the experts in the field, just from the emergency physician side, from a pharmaceutical expert side. So it's actually really awesome to be able to ask him questions. A lot of people did submit questions. I have a ton of questions. And I kind of wanted to break it up into two buckets. The first one being about the vaccine development, and the second one more being about the vaccine distribution. So just a few logistical questions about vaccine that you've seen, just questions that some people have submitted. The spike protein, it seems almost like poetic to me that the most defining attribute of the coronavirus is the spikes that are on it. And, it is such a vital protein in order to gain entry into the cell and whatnot. And that's, it's ultimately its downfall, it gives it that defining, spiky appearance. How do you know how, I'm assuming that because it's so vital to the cell that it wouldn't be, to the virus, that it wouldn't mutate much, but can you just talk a little bit about, if these vaccines do prove to be effective and they go out, it seems like it wouldn't be something that would be too, that would cause subsequent dosages too much, right? Because of the mutations?
Yeah, I think that's right. We don't know. It's a novel virus. So it's a novel virus. So kind of time will tell on some of these things. The important thing to note that, again, I think a lot of folks on the line already recognize, like, the flu is different from this because the flu, has the H's and N's, and every year you've got like different circulating strands or versions of the flu A, flu B, H1N1, all that stuff. So the flu's a little bit different. Like, this is COVID-19. It's mutating because all viruses mutate. And there are mutations in the spike protein that help virologists figure out which ones are more common. Like, there's kind of the predominant European form and then the original China, kind of where it originated. But it's not thought yet to be playing such a significant role that it would impact significantly vaccines. But it's just something that time will really only, tell. Again, because it's only been 10 months that this thing has been on the planet, or longer, who knows? I just read last night about about COVID being in California in December of 2019, which is kind of funny. You and I both were probably in California in December of 2019 and just totally clueless to it all. Anyway, time will tell.
Great. And then second of all, talking about like the immune response to the vaccine. Can you talk a little bit about any data that you're aware of between, something like giving antibodies passively, or giving the vaccine, or getting the virus infection, and what type of immune response each of those elicits?
Sure. So I think the hope is that the vaccine might elicit a more durable immune response than even a natural infection. And I think there's been a little bit of literature out there that might be the case. We know that people that get infected with COVID do have immune response, but there have been case reports, or I guess now reports, of people getting infected for the second time. It's thought that those people maybe got kind of a mild form the first go around, and so they, were susceptible to a second infection. So it's possible to get infected. Immunity likely does wane at a certain point, but there is a duration of immunity. And again, but only 10 months in, it's just going to take more longitudinal data to say what, but there is some hope that the vaccines might provide a little bit more of a durable immune response. I know there's a lot of kind of concern, and I think logistically speaking, it makes sense to be concerned about if people are going to need boosters and that sort of thing. I'm willing to get, as many vaccines as I need. I'm fine getting 2 shots, and I'm fine going back in 6 months and a year, if it means we can start to return to life being a little bit more normal and traveling and all of that. So I think it's, everybody's kind of inconvenience is a little bit different.
And then specifically between the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, because there are a lot of vaccine candidates, but those are probably going to be the 2 ones that are introduced to the United States and around the world soonest. Can you talk about the differences between the requirements for each of those vaccines between, I'm pretty sure that both of them are two dosages, but as far as, the storage and transportation of those and how you envision those being used differently?
Yeah, sure. So I think the Pfizer vaccine is 21 days apart, I believe. I know mine, the Moderna one that I am enrolled in the trial, is 28 days apart. So that right there is going to create some just challenge logistically. They've been talking about kind of vaccine cards so that you know which one you got. I've never asked what flu shot brand I've gotten, for example, and I did this year because I know that like I need to ask. And I think everybody on the line, just get ready to ask, which one is this? Because you're going to need to know kind of when to come back. And I know that you give those like appointment reminder cards, but can you just, I'm just kind of thinking through, like sometimes patients show up in the ER and you're like, what medicines are you on? And they're like, I don't know, the blue pill, the purple pill, there's going to be challenges that patients face with like figuring out when the right time to come back to get their vaccine is. So they've been thinking about, how we keep folks educated on that. The vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, as I mentioned, because of that M&M analogy, that it's kind of chocolate that can really easily melt, or mRNA degrades very quickly. You do need to wrap it in lipids, and so that's what I think that they are. But to be honest, like this is proprietary stuff, so I don't know exactly, but it has to be kept frozen at a very low temperature. Pfizer's, I think, is like around negative 110 degrees. Moderna's is a little bit warmer than that, but still pretty frozen. Some of the newer, or some of the ones that are still in development, the phase 3, the adenovirus vectors, I believe those can be refrigerated at kind of normal refrigerator temperature. So that's another reason why it's kind of good to have multiple approaches. Pfizer's done amazing things to build their supply chain. There's some great articles about it. Wall Street Journal had one. They've spent billions of dollars in investing in their own cold storage chain. And they've already started flying the vaccine from Belgium to the US. They flew it to Chicago. I think I tweeted about it. I love to see the United flight that they chartered filled with vaccine. They had to get a special waiver because the plane had 5 times more dry ice than the FAA typically allows on a plane. So there's just amazing stuff happening that folks don't really think about on a daily basis. And the supply chain aspects are really, really, really a lot to deal with. Thankfully, there are super smart people thinking about it, both with Pfizer, and then they're relying. The government bought all of the I think the first 300 million doses, I want to say. So the government is kind of telling them where to go. They're kind of handling the distribution allocations.
Great, thanks. So another thing about the vaccine development. So one of the most historical critiques about clinical trials is that they're not diverse enough. And knowing that this virus hits communities of color harder than others, do you feel that the pharmaceutical companies have done enough to make sure that these vaccine candidates won't add to the harm of these patients, especially those that are with high blood pressure and diabetes, and knowing that this is going to potentially be a global vaccine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Diversity in clinical trials is an area that we really need to focus on as an industry, and it's something that we have been thinking a lot more about because of COVID. And as everyone on the line knows, COVID's really unmasked a lot of health disparities that we all kind of knew were there, but it's shown them in very stark contrast. COVID is disproportionately impacting communities of color, and those communities are also dying at higher rates than non-white or than white communities. So it's really awful, kind of the health disparities that it really just unmasked. It was there already, but this virus kind of brought it to the forefront. So I heard Dr. Fauci talk about how you don't want to have the kind of triple threat where communities are impacted by it, they're not included in the clinical trials, and then because of that, they're scared to take the vaccine, so then they're still more susceptible to the disease. So there's been a lot done to increase the enrollment of minorities in COVID vaccine clinical trials. I was on a panel recently with Pfizer's chief patient officer, and she talked about the amount of advertising that they did directly to Black communities, for example, working with trusted voices from those communities, local voices, working with kind of local churches. Another key thing is finding diverse investigators, clinical trial investigators that make patients feel comfortable. Let's be honest, patients often don't feel comfortable or sometimes don't feel comfortable with people that don't look like them or can't relate to them. And I know that's our challenge always, is to find a way to connect and identify with the patients that we're working with. But sometimes it's, other people are going to have, if you're from the community, you're going to have an easier time. So I think that's one kind of big longitudinal challenge that we have. They've done amazing work, though. I think both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine way exceeded the kind of traditional enrollment that we see at baseline for diversity in clinical trials. I believe it was upwards of 20% in one of the two. I can pull the exact stats if folks are interested, but we really way exceeded kind of traditional. We have ways to go, and particularly as it comes to vaccine confidence, making sure that those communities feel safe taking the vaccine. And those are questions that you should really invite with your family. I started to do it because it is interesting to hear what to folks in your own family, what are they thinking about? What are they worried about? And it's always surprising. I mean, I asked it to patients pre-COVID, like, oh, what do you think it is? And you never know what people are going to say. And I think in this vaccine confidence realm, it has been really interesting to hear what folks' concerns are.
And speaking to that, how do you suggest that we talk to patients and family members and community members about getting vaccinated if they're concerned about, what are the long-term risks of taking a vaccine? Because we might not know if there was some potential risk long-term. I would say that it probably is less than the long-term risks of getting COVID, but how would you suggest that we go about that?
Sure. It's it's a really tough thing. And I heard someone really smart say we as people just don't do a great job of kind of assessing our own risk. If you were to ask, or I guess broadly speaking, what's the most dangerous part about getting a vaccine? And people think, oh, maybe there's something in it or there's a side effect. And quite honestly, the most dangerous part about getting a vaccine is getting in your car and driving to get it, because getting in a car is way more dangerous. The risk of a car accident, and you don't even think about it. The thing about these vaccines, and I think a reassuring factor in the clinical trials, is that they are as large as any other vaccine clinical trial. We're talking 44,000 patients in Pfizer's, 38,000 in Moderna. Each of those people got 2 shots. So you double that, you've got, 60 and 88,000, 88,000 post-injection data points. They've been following these people 2 months since the second injection. And remember, mRNA degrades basically right away. You get the injection and it's gone within a few days. So, I don't know. I personally feel very comfortable. I think we need to just talk to our patients about kind of relative risk. As you said, the risk of COVID is really significant. The likelihood that if you get COVID, your life is going to be impacted by it is so high. And then the fact that you're willing to drive to get it, and that's probably the most risky part about getting it. People just fear the unknown, I think, and it's that vaccine is a little bit of a black box. So that's why I like talking about it, and hopefully some of the analogies help you as well, to just think about it like an M&M. M&Ms aren't scary.
That's great. I love that. Also, thank you everybody who is submitting stuff to the chat. I'm reading them and doing my best to get to everybody's questions, in addition to the ones that were pre-submitted. So another question that's come in is talking about the clinical trials. Did these clinical trials include participants with pre-existing conditions or who were immunocompromised? And what are the recommendations for those patients?
Yeah, that's a great question. They did actually. At a certain point, Pfizer expanded their enrollment of their trial from 30,000 to 44,000. And one of the reasons that they made the protocol change was to include people with HIV, I believe hepatitis, some immune compromised type states, to be able to assess the impact of the vaccine in those communities. The other big one is age. So as you age, your immune system kind of ages with you. And so we know that vaccines, tend to have less of a robust response in the elderly. Other vaccines have shown that. And so they made an effort to do kind of subgroup analysis on the elderly. What I've seen is actually the data is quite strong in the elderly. So that's another kind of surrogate for immunocompromised. It's not that they're immunocompromised, although in emergency medicine, there are a few conditions that we typically think of as have a higher antenna up for infection in these age groups or in these situations. One of them is age group. Of course, neonates like less than 6 weeks that come in with a fever, we do everything because we just assume their immune system isn't up and running yet, and their blood-brain barrier hasn't really fully formed yet. So we're very cautious in neonates, as I think y'all are aware, and then also tend to be very cautious in elderly individuals as well. That come in with fever and suspected infection.
That's great. So I kind of want to transition into vaccine distribution. And I think that this is where the conversation gets a little bit trickier naturally. You know, this is one of the most unprecedented things that we've ever experienced from a public health and medical standpoint. Of course, we've relied on the pharmaceutical companies to develop this vaccine, these vaccines, different options. How do you envision the differences between the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine? And you know, you have more access to data, so please correct me if anything I'm saying is wrong. But it seems like what I've been seeing is that the Moderna vaccine is actually a lot better targeted for patients with severe COVID than the Pfizer vaccine. And I'm not sure if you can speak on to that because of member companies, but can you just say like how you envision seeing a world with two vaccines and what goes where based on both of their strengths?
Sure. Well, I think to a certain extent, we probably have to wait to see what the label says. And the Pfizer vaccine is gonna, you know, likely come out in the days following the AdCom. I think the FDA commissioner said maybe 3 or 4 days they'll have a decision, and Moderna probably shortly after that. So I would imagine that the label will probably give us a sense or an indication. I will also say that, you know, maybe initially too, you know, it may not be like you go and kind of decide. It may be based on allocations in your hospital. If you're a healthcare worker, you might get one based on what the hospital has, kind of like a flu shot. It's still important to know what you got because you need to know when you need to come back. And so that's where that card plays in. But I think we'll get more information on if there's any special circumstances or special populations once the FDA looks at all the data and comes out with a label. The UK actually fully approved the Pfizer vaccine, I think yesterday. And that's a big deal. The UK is a little bit different from the US. And I didn't know most of this until yesterday, but as you know, Nick, we have a big international team that kind of taught me a lot about drug approvals in other countries. And the UK has a different system. And now because of Brexit too, they're not part of the EU. And so they could really work on their own. I think the biggest difference that I learned is that the FDA takes all of the data and they basically kind of do the math themselves. Whereas the UK's review process is to look at the math and just make sure it looks kind of right without kind of replicating it. I don't know if that kind of analogy makes sense, but basically the FDA apparently has a team of like 150 people that are going through thousands and thousands of pages. I read another tweet. All my information comes from Twitter that said, you know, in one submission for a different vaccine, they said if you took all of the paper and you stacked it up, it would be as tall as a Sears tower because it is just massive amounts of data. And I figure that, you know, anecdotally speaking, when I would go to that app, I mean, I was putting in data every single day. You figure I'm one of 30,000 people that are entering, you know, whether or not I have a headache today, whether or not, you know, the questions are, you know, just really long. And anyway, there's a lot of data to look at.
And then, so you said AdCom. Can you just, you know, say a little bit about where each of those two vaccines and what does it mean to apply for the emergency use authorization, which is the EUA, and what the AdCom is, what they're going to be looking at, and the next steps after that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think folks should feel really confident that the FDA is taking all the appropriate steps. They're going through absolutely every kind of step. The only real difference is that it's a public health emergency, so it's an emergency use authorization, not, you know, kind of a non-emergency use authorization or a full approval. The UK was a little bit different in that they did grant a full approval, but their laws are a little bit different. And you know, for all I know, they may not have the equivalent of an EUA, but you know, that's kind of a specific question that I think my international colleagues would be able to better answer. To get to the FDA process here in the US, you know, they had to do the trial. They had to find definitive evidence that it worked. I believe the FDA, when they put out guidance, said they were looking for a vaccine that would be at least 50% effective. And you know, these vaccines have been 95% effective. Of course, they're going to look very carefully at all the safety data. The FDA takes all that information and they basically run the math themselves. They look at it all. They kind of recreate the analyses on their own. And then they present that to this external advisory board. So the FDA will have their internal perspective, and then they look for validation from external folks. So it's not just Pfizer. Like Pfizer submitted the application, and I think they clearly believe that they have an effective vaccine based on what they've said. Then it's up to the FDA to say, do we believe that? And then the FDA presents it then again to an external advisory committee of folks that are experts in the field. And they look at the data that the FDA kind of went through and presents, and they decide whether or not, or they make a recommendation that they concur or they disagree. In certain circumstances they do. But, you know, based on what everybody has said, it seems like the kind of preponderance of data is pointing in a positive direction. And I am very anxious to see the answer come out.
Yeah. When do you envision us being able to see more of the data? Do you think that that will be, is that after the advisory committee, or when do you think it'll be more widespread?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think both companies have committed to publishing the clinical trial data in a peer-reviewed journal. So I imagine at some point we'll be getting a New England Journal of Medicine alert that the Pfizer clinical trial data is out there. I think Gilead similarly did that for remdesivir. They worked with the NIH on that trial, and they published it in the New England Journal.
Okay, so you would say that that would probably be after the advisory committee?
I think so. I don't think it's going to come out in the next week. So I would think it would come out at some point after the advisory committee.
Sweet, great. That'll be so interesting.
Yeah.
And as far as, you know, payment goes, you know, how does, you know, of course you represent, you know, lots of pharmaceutical companies who have poured a lot of money into these vaccines. How do you think that we should think about the balancing, making sure that everybody gets a vaccine who needs a vaccine, especially the most vulnerable patients who have these pre-existing conditions, you know, and also setting a price point for this vaccine?
Sure. Well, you know, this is probably going to be one of the most valuable kind of inventions, and certainly of the year, potentially of many, many years. But manufacturers committed to pricing responsibly. They're you know, they're pricing effectively based on volume as opposed to based on the true value, because the true value is just almost immeasurable. You think about all the economic stimulus that's been required, the amount of money that Congress has poured into trying to get the economy from sputtering, even though it really has, and all the people that have lost jobs. Anyway, you could go on and on about the impact that the vaccine is going to have. From a pure dollars and cents standpoint, the government bought the vaccine. I think that there are estimates out there. They paid somewhere in the $20 to $40 range, depending on the manufacturer. You know, I think you can probably find it. That's a really great, very low price. You know, the testing that we're reimbursing for is like in the $150 to $200 range for tests. Obviously, there's lots of services out there that are more expensive. An ICU stay for COVID is going to be $40,000. So anyway, this is going to be an extremely valuable and very, you know, very valuable addition to the arsenal. And the government has procured a supply for the US population in order to be able to offer it to the US population for free. I know that the healthcare system's complex, so there's a lot of unique situations that we could get into, like in Medicare, for example. They said for the Medicare population, the vaccine is going to be available under Part B as opposed to Part D, and that'll be offered with no co-payments. For commercial insurance, you know, for the uninsured, there's kind of a safety net program where you can go to get the vaccine for free. The idea is that Americans will not be kind of paying. Under some circumstances, providers that administer it might bill insurance for an administration fee. And that's where it kind of gets a little bit confusing, because that's different from the vaccine. The vaccine itself, the government has bought it on behalf of the American people and will be getting it for free.
And how do you envision the balancing between the demands of the United States, which is seeing the worst COVID outbreak currently, you know, and has been for a while, with also the needs of other countries and the international community?
Yeah, and I'm sorry you broke up a little bit. You said it was something about we have the worst outbreak in the world and balancing the needs of other countries. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, clearly the challenge, and there's been a lot of that kind of nationalism where countries are like, you know, everybody's kind of grabbing the PPE and keeping it for themselves. They're enacting trade barriers, and it gets back to one of the points that I made at the beginning, which is kind of we need multiple shots on goal because we need multiple vaccine candidates that have multiple approaches and multiple requirements that kind of fit the needs of a really diverse world that we live in. I think there's been also a commitment by a number of manufacturers to make sure that the developing world is getting access. The US is a special case study right now. We really do need the vaccine because there's a lot of suffering going on in this country, a lot of death. We had almost 3,000 people die yesterday from COVID. And by comparison, you had Pearl Harbor, which was like 2,300, and 9/11, which was 2,600. And just yesterday, more people died of COVID than either of those things. And that's happening day after day after day. So we have a whole world to look out for. And certainly in the US, there's a lot of pain and suffering. So we definitely need to get the vaccine to US patients as well so we can try and end the pandemic quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one of the last questions, just as an ER physician and as somebody that has seen who has bared the brunt of all of the pandemic, over the past few months, and will unfortunately have to for the next few months until there's wide enough spread of this vaccine. What are the things that you have seen on the front lines and also within the pharmaceutical industry? What strengths and weaknesses have you seen exposed in our system this year?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that just purely from a clinical standpoint, I think a lot of physicians really pulled together. It's been an incredibly challenging time to work because it's been scary. You think back to early in the pandemic and we didn't know what type of mask to wear. People were sleeping in their garages because they didn't know how contagious this thing was, if it was on fomites or anyway. I think the medical community has kind of pulled together. And also to a certain degree, people have kind of meshed specialties. We've seen people become ER physicians when there were ER shortages. We've seen pediatricians doing adult COVID wards. So I think that it shows the resiliency, to a certain degree, it's shown the resiliency of providers. At the same time, the fact that, so many people lost their job and lost health insurance, I think does kind of underscore, the coverage issues that many people have faced, and the need to have a good safety net and to have adequate health insurance coverage has been a really important theme. Yeah. And then of course, with all the job losses come affordability issues. And, I think in terms of solutions, we're going to be talking about, once we get over the pandemic, long-term solutions are going to be, top of the agenda.
Yeah. And how did you respond to the news when you found out that Pfizer had come up with a vaccine? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, sorry.
Okay. How did you respond to, how did you find out that Pfizer had gotten a vaccine, and what was your reaction?
About their data?
Yeah.
I probably heard about it on Twitter because I'm on it all the time. I saw it and I was just ecstatic. I mean, it was really just that incredible news. It felt like, pandemics don't end like wars do. And, you think about World War II when there were parties in the streets, it's not going to be the same because it goes out kind of, it fades out as opposed to ending just you sign something and it's over. But that was one of the moments that I think I'll remember for a long time, where it feels like this is the turning point. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to be over. It's going to be over. I can't say exactly when, but it is going to be over.
Yeah. Well, with that, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. This has been great, just hearing your thoughts as an ER physician, as a pharmaceutical expert. It is always a pleasure to see you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, and good luck to you, and good luck to everybody.
Yeah. All right.
Stay safe.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.